it is my pleasure to have as a guest today Israel's former ambassador to the United States, former member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, Michael Oren, and author of a New York Times best-selling book called Power, Faith, and Fantasy, which has an entire passage dedicated to the American response to the Armenian Genocide. Michael, thank you so much for being with us here today in Jerusalem at the Armenian Quarter. Michael, you grew up in New Jersey next to the Armenian community. Tell us about that.
First of all, delightful to be with you, Diana. Thank you for having me. I grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in a Jewish community, but alongside the Jewish community was an Armenian community. And Armenians and Jews in the United States get along very, very well. We both come from warm and inviting, vaguely Middle Eastern cultures. And we went to school together, we socialized together. I would say, I hate to say some of my best friends, but literally some of my best friends. So a strong feeling of the Armenians without ever knowing anything about their Armenian history. All I knew that these were nice, warm people. I first encountered Armenian history when I was working for the Israeli government. I've had several government positions. I've been in the Knesset, in our parliament. I've been the deputy to the prime minister, but in one iteration, I was the advisor to the prime minister for church affairs. So I learned all the Christian communities in this country, and there are many, and especially the Armenian community and the Armenian Quarter, and the challenges facing the Armenian Quarter as Jerusalem as a city was undergoing many, many transformations. And some of those transformations were perceived as challenging, and not just perceived, they were challenging to the traditional status of the Armenian Quarter in the city. So that was always an important issue for me. Later still, I'm an historian by training. I did my graduate work at Princeton with a head of the department, Bernard Lewis, a very famous historian of the Middle East, who was also an expert on Turkey. And if you were an expert on Turkey in American academia, you were not about to talk about the Armenian Genocide. And so I didn't learn about it in my studies. I only learned about it when I undertook a very ambitious project to write, and I would say this with a smile, the biggest and best comprehensive history of American involvement in the Middle East from 1776 to the present. I say it's the biggest and the best because it's the only one. And it's called Power, Faith, and Fantasy, and its history. And of course, reading about American policy in the Middle East in the 1890s, at the beginning of the 20th century, and then of course in 1915, and going through the documents, sitting in the archives of the State Department, all of a sudden, oh my God, what are these horrors? What's going on here? I'd never encountered it before. So everything I know about the Armenian Genocide, I encountered in the most immediate, unadulterated way, which is right from the documents. And I would come out of the archives sick to my stomach.
In Washington.
Yeah. And later still, as ambassador in Washington and then in the Israeli government, I was a strong proponent that Israel would recognize the Armenian Genocide. It wasn't always to the delight of our Turkish, at one point allies, then our antagonists, and now more recently our relationship with Azerbaijan, and because Azerbaijan is a strategic ally. But I strongly believe that the State of Israel has a historical and moral obligation to recognize the genocide and to do what we can to build testaments to it, to enable the world community, to help the world community remember this horrific event.
You are now working inside the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and the Armenian genocide question, recognition, comes up. Take us through that. What happens behind these doors?
So this was in 2016, I believe. The Speaker of the Knesset was a dear friend of mine, Yuli Edelstein. He himself had been a prisoner of the Soviet regime and served time in the Gulag in Siberia in hard labor. At one point in my early years, I had worked with the Jewish underground in the Soviet Union, and Yuli Edelstein was my contact there. So we knew each other from the underground, from the dark days. And Yuli, I know, was very supportive of official recognition of the genocide. And what he did was to inaugurate a recognition day for the Armenian genocide. And I spoke on that day. But still, there was a lot of reticence on the official level, particularly on the security level. 2016 was sort of a transition period. We had had a long alliance with Turkey. That ended with the ascendance of Mr. Erdogan, who was an Islamicist, had close relationships to Hamas and other terrorist organizations. But just at that juncture, when Israel began to move away from the Turkish alliance, we discovered Azerbaijan. One of the messages that I often got from Armenian friends was, you Jews are lucky, quote unquote, right? Italicized lucky. You have the world recognize your genocide. You had reparations paid by the Germans. You have museums to the Holocaust in many, many cities. In the world, of course, in Washington, D.C., but not just in Washington, D.C., in Europe, memorials all over the place. We don't have that closure. And moreover, you are now going through Holocaust withdrawal. As the generation of Holocaust survivors die out, as memory of the Holocaust begins to fade, you Jews have 40 years on us, right? 30, 40 years on us. And so our memory is really fading. And so there's a sense also of time. The time is a factor here. And we thought maybe the 100th anniversary would be a major event in acknowledging the genocide. That's now passed. We're almost nearly a decade beyond that. So the urgency for me remains, and I think it's very much apart from any strategic interest that Israel might have. Armenians have a very long and distinguished and fascinating history. We're sitting here in the now just recently opened Museum of Armenian History and Culture in the Old City. Just really breathtaking. And I'm going to get a tour. And there's so much to see. And understand that Jerusalem's history, the land, the Holy Land's history is your history too. But really what works in government, and having been in government, is a message from our American allies, from Congress of the United States. It's saying this is what we expect. By the way, the first use of the word Holocaust, well before Auschwitz, was used to describe the Armenian Genocide. And many of the means to which the Turks massacred Armenians were adapted by the Germans. And I believe it was Hitler himself said, well, who remembers the Armenian? No one remembers it. So there's a direct connection between the Armenian genocide of World War I and the genocide of the Jews by the Nazis in World War II. And it's also not coincidental, I think, Diana, that the Turks' allies in World War I were the Germans. If you asked Americans, I would say, 98, 99% of Americans have no idea where Armenia is, and wouldn't know the history of Armenia, wouldn't know that Armenians were the first Christians in the world, really. And you'd even ask people who are very observant Christians in the United States, ask them who was the first Christian community in history. I don't know if they'd know that. They often say, Diana, that Israel's PR is so bad. But I would often say to Armenians, your PR actually manages to be worse than ours, because people don't know your story. And one of the ways I've noticed to get a story across would be to, and don't make fun of me when I say this, to get a Netflix series about it, a fictional series, not a documentary, with Armenian heroes, and all of a sudden everyone's going to get interested.
The geopolitics of genocide. Take us through that article.
The Armenian story, and the Armenian genocide specifically, has been the victim of great power clashes, of strategic and geopolitical interests. We focused on Israel here, and our relations first with Turkey and then with Azerbaijan as factors which militated against Israel's willingness/ability to acknowledge the genocide. But it wasn't just Israel. I think that there are about 194 countries in the world. Only 34 have recognized, at last count, have recognized that genocide. Why is that? It's not a heavy lift to recognize another people's suffering. Everyone recognizes the Cambodian genocide. Everyone recognizes the Rwandan genocide. What's going on here? And what's going on here is geopolitics and interest. It's oil. It is, Azerbaijan is a major producer of oil in the world, and it's a conduit for oil across the Caucasus. Turkey is probably the most strategically situated country on the planet, right? Controlling waterways, controlling Russia's access to the Mediterranean, the Dardanelles Straits, the Bosphorus, and people have been fighting over this area, for 3,000 years. Mr. Erdogan in Turkey manages to be a member of NATO and also have a strong relationship with Russia, because nobody will take him on because he's so strategically important. So strategically important. I'll give you another little insight. When I was working during my Knesset years in 2015, 16, 17, to try to get recognition for the Armenian Genocide, one of the issues that were raised by not just by the security establishment, but also by parts of our business community, was that we need the air hub in Istanbul. Now, this is before the Abraham Accords, and there were direct flights, to various countries. We could fly. Our planes can fly over Saudi Arabia. They can fly over the Gulf. Back then, they couldn't, and vast number of Israeli planes and flights had to connect through Istanbul, and there was actual real fear. Believe me, this is a real story. That if we recognize the genocide, the Turks would close their airport to us. And there'd be a huge economic price to pay. Amazing that, huh? That's the geopolitics. That's what we're talking about. And it's just been Armenia's tragic and bizarre fate to fall between the cracks of these clashing interests, where you don't have that with Rwanda, Cambodia, and certainly not with the Holocaust. After I published that book and those articles, I was informed in no uncertain terms that I should not be visiting Turkey. Should not be visiting Turkey. I have not visited Turkey since writing that book.
Do you think that there can ever be peace that can be achieved?
I've been involved in the peace process here going back 30 years. I participated in the last round of negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And I will tell you, after all these years of study, the core of this conflict is not Jerusalem, it's not settlements, it's not borders, okay? It's not even security. The core of the conflict is identity and narratives. And we have to address that. Not easy. We have to address it.
Have you ever been to Armenia?
No, I'm not. Well, you want to invite me? I'd love to go.
We will gladly wait for you in Armenia and definitely hope to see you there.